We now turn to chapter 15, which is devoted to the subject of architecture. We call this Discoveries in World Architecture. What an exciting chapter to discover as we look at art appreciation, because we know that architecture is one of the five visual arts. We have painting, we have sculpture, we have architecture, we have photography, and we have computer graphics. But we come today looking at architecture as a means of working with the forces and laws of gravity, and at the same time being creative with shape and with direction and usage of form. So we go into this chapter looking at architecture, but first we want to define architecture. What is architecture? How is architecture different from sculpture? Well, we know that painting is a two-dimensional process, but sculpture is a three-dimensional form, and obviously architecture is a three-dimensional form. But the description of architecture is both the process and the product of planning, of designing and constructing buildings, and the other physical structures that work with our use and need for housing, for warmth, or for coolness, for working conditions, for climate conditions. Architecture then is a functional sculpture. In other words, it's just not a piece of sculpture or a giant piece of sculpture, but it's governed by the laws of gravity. And then there are the usage. Space is one of the biggest factors in architecture. Structure, uh, the content of materials that we use, but there's a general term we like to use in architecture. We call it form follows function. In other words, it looks like or is designed for what it has to do. A spoon has to contain a certain amount of food or liquid. A fork is designed to pick up food. A knife is designed to cut food. So therefore, form follows function. We can't eat soup with a fork. Neither can we eat soup with a knife. So the form and function, glass, bowls, and so we come up with architecture, and it looks like what it has to do. Then we go into the ornate and the most decorative forms of architecture. This is the Opera House in Paris, one of the great pieces of architecture of the world, the Opera House in Paris. On the upper left, all of us should be familiar with St. Peter's Basilica, and the dome was designed by Michelangelo. And then we see a series of skyscrapers in the upper right, out of material that reflects. So artists are now not just coming up with rectangular shapes and forms, but with materials that reflect and give a different dimension to the building. And then we have those architects who are daring. They're willing to go against and come close to violating the laws of gravity. And yet these structures must stand and undergo all types of weather. Homes, this obviously is not a home for the North Pole, a home for open place, and obviously seasonal for swimming. And look how the rectangle was used and how white is repeated over and over again. White reflects heat. So when we look at Greece, or many of the houses in Greece are all painted white, is to reflect the heat. Then we go back 500 to 500 BC, during the classical period of Pericles, who wanted to build an Acropolis complex that was like none other. Athens, or the Acropolis, is dedicated to the Greek goddess Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom. And so Pericles wanted to build a monument and a center, a worship center, like none other. And this building that you see right here, it is called the Parthenon. The Parthenon is perhaps the most imitated building in all the world. In Washington, D.C., and capitals and banks, all kinds of institutional architecture, they use this basic form. And the Parthenon was considered the most perfect building ever put together. If we were to construct it today, some estimate that the cost would be $1 billion because it's all marble. But in its day, and of course, the bottom right, we see as it looks today in its ruins. The Greeks don't want to restore it like it was at 500 BC. Just above that, there was a proposition made some 22 years ago, and the population of Greece voted to leave it as it is. Let's restore it as it is. Why is it deteriorating? It's deteriorated more in the last 70 years than the last 2,000. Why? Because of acid rain. And acid rain has a deteriorating effect on marble. But look how it looked in its royal day. Look at the cornice. Look at the pediment. Look at how it was painted. This was the Parthenon. And Athena stood so high that her headdress was like about 3 feet from the ceiling. And of course, that figure you see here was an actual scale drawing as to when you went through that temple, that Parthenon, you would see Athena standing there in a statue, and of course, with dramatic lighting. The Parthenon complex has many buildings, but there's 4 that I put emphasis on. One is called the Propylaea. That's the gateway into the Acropolis. The second, obviously, is the Parthenon, the temple of Athena. The third we call the Erechtheum, and the fourth we call the temple of Athena Nike, and we have reasons for that. But we want to introduce you to another architectural form. It's called the amphitheater. That's the outdoor theater, and if you can imagine your breakfast bowl, and if you were to cut it in half, you would have what we basically would call an amphitheater shape. And of course, the bottom of the bowl would be the stage, and then the surrounding would be where people would sit on benches. Everyone would sit, everyone could see, everyone was on a different level. This is the famous amphitheater in Israel. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And at night or during performances, people would come from miles around to see actors and actresses in what we call an amphitheater. The actors and actresses and performers would dress sometimes in a building behind it and then come out on this stage. But again, it is a bowl shape, shaped like a regular breakfast bowl. Again, form follows function. Everyone could see. No one blocks another individual. Each semicircle was graduated into levels that went up, and we have what is called the amphitheater, the outdoor theater. On the bottom left, you see the way it appears today, but on the right, you see the way it appeared in its time. We see the before and after base here. And amphitheaters house many, many people. Now, in our textbook, in figure 1510, we see the Temple of Hera but we see a basic Doric order. We're going to study those orders. And the lines in these columns, we call them flutes. Now, there were different types of building. One was stacking and piling. We talked about that when we studied Egypt. But now we come to where we have two uprights and a cross member. We call that post and lintel. Post and lintel architecture. And we study three orders, Greek orders, and you can tell the order by its capital. Now, where's the capital? The capital is at the top of the column. When we see lines, as I told you before, those are called flutes. We have three orders. The Doric order has a base that is not too fancy, but above it is, of course, what we call an architrave. See number 3 here. I am giving you this diagram in your handout. We have what is called the frieze, which is above the architrave, and frieze is spelled F-R-I-E-Z-E, not two E's. And the frieze, of course, is where sometimes we would find sculpture and sometimes not. In the Doric, this is called a triglyph, and of course, the piece of sculpture, relief sculpture, is called a metope. But we won't go into that right now, but we want you to note other things. The center order with the scrolls is called the Ionic order. And that has these scrolls. These scrolls have a name. And the name, of course, is a volute. Last but not least, we have this flowery column here, capital, and that is called the Corinthian order. So we have Doric, Ionic, Corinthian orders. And this, of course, is the shaft. All of them have shafts. All columns are not fluted, but I want you to know these basic terms and these Greek orders. That's very important. Now, in Roman times, they came up with an invention that we just kind of take for granted. It's called the arch. And prior to that time, it was very hard to open up space inside these walls that were very heavy. It would push space down. But the keystone was placed into the arch. The arch and the keystone showed or had a role which was to push the weight down and balance the weight in an opening here, which we call the arch. Later, if we kept using the arch, we would call it a vault. Now, this is very important, and I want you to study this on figure 15 and 12 in your textbook. I also want you to study these orders, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. We're going to come back to those. So here we see the arch. We see a keystone pushing that weight down, opening this up. But as you repeat the arch over and over again, we have what is called a vault. And then sometimes those walls need reinforcement because you have stained glass windows there. So we have what are called buttresses. And the piers also bear a lot of weight in the arch. We will see that when we go to the Cathedral of St. John Divine. So the Romans used this arch as a basis for building all of these aqueducts that brought water into the city of Rome. Rome had running water 100 AD, and they did it through these aqueducts that were constructed with just a slight pitch so as to bring water and bring it on and let gravity bring it down into the city. Now with the pyramids, and we've studied the Great Pyramid of Khufu, which is the larger one, we see that was done with stacking and piling, putting one block on top of another to create this giant tomb That was this one pyramid. Took 200,000 men, 20 years to build the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or as the Europeans call Cheops. And of course, this had some 2 million stones piled on each other. It had tunnels. It had all kinds of openings inside, which showed the ingenuity of the Egyptians 2470 BC. That's almost 4,500 years ago. They knew a perfect isosceles triangle. But the Romans went on to develop their barrel vault, which was a series of arches. And as a result, they built the Colosseum in Rome. The Colosseum, you can visit it. I've visited it many times. This is an aerial view built around 72 AD. But it was a fantastic architectural achievement. It could house 50,000 people. It had a top in which slaves would pull, and it would cover the top with only an opening. And of course, lions and tigers had an elevator system for animals, and of course, for prisons and for gladiators. And of course, this was the entertainment center of Rome during the first century. Now, the Romans gave us another thing other than the arch. They gave us the dome. And so when you look at the capital of the United States, you're looking at not only a Greek portico, which has Corinthian columns and what we call a pediment. And the pediment is that triangular shape that brings together this post and lintel. But we have a dome, and that dome has a rotunda. This was given to us by the Romans. What a magnificent contribution. So when you go to Washington, D.C., it almost looks like Greece and Rome, so as to present a physical duplication of a democracy. And that's why many of our buildings in Washington look like Greek and Roman temples. But the one building standing today, it was opened this morning. People walked in there this morning. It was built around 117 AD. It's called the Pantheon, not the Parthenon, but the Pantheon. And the Pantheon stands for many gods. It had the Greek portico, which is the pediment and the columns, but then behind it, it had a fantastic rotunda. And that rotunda had at the top of it what we call an oculus. It's an opening in the ceiling. And would you believe that over the past 2,000 years, rain has come through and it has not damaged this floor? As the sun moves, so does the circle and that shines on top of these coffers here. And what a fantastic building. They say Raphael is buried inside of the Pantheon. So when you go to Rome, make sure you put on your list to visit the Pantheon, which is the remaining building intact from 100 AD. We see the insurance buildings, we see the jazz and rock and roll monuments, we see buildings that are constructed where architects have just mastered not only the rectangle, but to work with round forms imitating Greece and Rome. One of the architectural features, and there are features you study. We studied the pediment and the columns. We also study something we call the niche, Niche. And that's a created space so as to create a shadow behind the sculpture, thus making it like a frame. So if you see the shadow behind this piece of sculpture with the niche, it sits inside the niche in order to frame it, and it stands out. Now, there are many parts of the Gothic cathedral. We don't have time to look at them. I'm going to put a outline into your study, and it's going to be a simple layout of a Gothic church. And there are certain things that we will see: the nave, we will see the transepts, we'll see the rose window. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, there are places in which the ground is changing, and in Italy, we have this famous Leaning Tower of Pisa. I've been fortunate enough to climb up to the top, and alongside of it is a church building. They call it the baptistry. But this is the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which is near Florence, Italy. This, of course, is our own Essex County College, and we opened and came into this building in 1976. It won all kinds of awards in terms of its beauty and its architecture, and we are all proud to be a part of Essex County College. Now, when you go into a Gothic cathedral, they all have the same basic layout. It's called a Greek cross. But the main aisle is called the nave, N-A-V-E. And of course, as you go to the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, or St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, or you go to Sacred Heart Cathedral in Newark, you will see that it has the same layout: the nave, the narthex. Look at how this architect put together the Air Force Chapel in Colorado, and how the triangle is used in different positions, same shape, to create this magnificent chapel. We're all familiar with the Arc of Triumph, which you see is an arch, and of course they created these arches as monuments. And we see the keystone here, and the victors come through and walk and march through the Arc of Triumph, which is very decorative and ornate. So in Europe, we go to Florence. Now, Florence has the great dome here of its cathedral, and this is the Florence Cathedral, and it's sort of like, we call this a rib vault. And as you go to the Borghese Gardens, which are so beautiful and overlook the city of Florence, you see the big Duomo, or the dome. Next to the cathedral is the baptistry, and they have doors on them that are called the Gates of Paradise. These were created, and these were cast pieces of bronze, the Old Testament, and each of these panels has a story about the Old Testament. And remember, people could not read or write during this particular time, and so they had to use art as a means of teaching Christianity. Another unique piece of architecture, I've gone and looked at the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, in Israel. And Marc Chagall, great contemporary modern artist, went to Israel, and in the hospital created these 12 stained glass windows. There are 12, one representing each tribe of Israel. Another famous monument, which is all over the world, and again, that same layout, we have the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Notice how on the right you see the nave, and whenever you see a pointed arch, that means that's a Gothic cathedral. Now, these roofs were so heavy that they had to put buttresses. That's what you see here. These are flying buttresses to push and reinforce the walls so that the roof would not cave, because we had stained glass windows, and stained glass windows weaken the walls. So the buttresses help to reinforce those walls. The Cathedral of Notre Dame has what we call a rose window, and we'll study more about that. They removed this one during World War II because they were afraid that if Paris were bombed, then it would be destroyed. So we have this basic concept and layout that I want all of you to know. Now there's a piece here, it's called the vestibule. We call it the vestibule, but it's called the narthex, Narthex. Then we have the main aisle, it's called the nave. Then we have the crossings, this part of the cross, and we call it a transept. And then we come up further, we have the choir, and then we have what is called an apse, where we can walk around it. When we go to the Cathedral of St. John Divine, we will do just that, walk around the apse, and we will walk down the nave. Now, this is the Cathedral in Ament. We have shots. We have the Cathedral Reims. All these European cathedrals all have the same layout, using vaults and using flying buttresses in order to support the walls. The buttress, as you can see, the walls were not very strong because of the stained glass windows. There's an architect that everyone talks about. We talked about Imhotep, the great Egyptian artist, but there's an American artist who did most of his work between the ages of 72 and 92 when he passed away. His name is Frank Lloyd Wright. And there was a school dedicated to him. I think it's still in operation. People who studied the way he would design a building. Lots of light, lots of wood, lots of roofs that had a hugging quality to it. And we can see in figure 1534 in our textbook, as well as 1537, this famous building is called Falling Water. It's located in Pennsylvania, Bear Run, Pennsylvania, and architectural students go to see this structure. It's called Falling Water. You can hear the water, and then, of course, in the wintertime, it freezes up. The TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport is something that's kind of daring because all these curves go on the fringes of violating the rules of gravity. So architects have to be very careful about how they create shapes that might not endure under pressure and heavy weather conditions. This is the interior of the terminal. New York and its uniqueness. And you might say, well, what does a park have to do with architecture? Everything, because it's such a contrast. On the left over here, we have what is called the West Side. And on this side of Fifth Avenue is the East Side. We have this building up here, which we will visit, called the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then we have an overlooking the park. The park in itself, that greenery, is so important in an urban environment. That's figure 1556 in your text. But look at this Port Authority PATH station that is designed here, just like stands up like an abstract amorphous form. We have art that centers around and combines landscaping with greenery. And of course, there's a museum in Spain, and it is called the Guggenheim Museum, not designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but what a unique museum it is, an art gallery in Spain. In Beijing, look at this building. It looks like it has legs. Look at figure 1545. And of course, this is in Beijing. But this Frank Lloyd Wright, this suave man who lived to be 92, who designed this Guggenheim Museum, beneath his photo here. And he died about 4 months before it opened. And of course, he designed work all over the country. He was suave. He liked the rectangle. He liked light, and he liked wood. When he designed a home, he made sure there was rich wood, uh, rich panels, rich kinds of flooring that he would put into his design of a home. This is a synagogue he designed. Look how you don't see the person who's speaking. You don't see the people. The focus is on the light that is coming in, the worship as you look up and as you see this uh, synagogue. But there's nothing like falling water, which is in Pennsylvania, and you can hear the water as you sleep or as you are part of this home. And then in the wintertime, when it freezes up, look how beautiful it is. Again, the name of this is Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm going to ask you to write about some of your favorite pieces of architecture. Here's the inside of Falling Water. We have a slate floor. Uh, you probably have to use your slippers, probably kind of a cold floor. But again, he used the elements and materials to make one feel different. And notice how he used light. And he had a number of uh, lights that came in through natural sunlight. The Guggenheim is very different from any other museum in the world. When you go there, you go to the top, you take the elevator to the top. It has a restaurant on the first floor, a bookstore on the first floor. But you go up to the top and you start and you come down, and you come down in a spiral. And as you come down in the spiral, you never miss any of the artworks. You see every artwork in the museum. A famous piece of architecture that has been some controversy in the news recently is called the Dome of the Rock. And when I took groups to Israel, we always would go in the Dome of the Rock. You must take your shoes off. Women have to leave their pocketbooks. And of course, I would stand outside and guard or go inside. But that dome was plated by King Hussein of Jordan. That is gold-plated dome, that whole dome. He sold an estate in order to make this. This is the place where Abraham offered him Isaac. You see some rocks in here. You see the place where Muhammad ascended up to heaven. And this is a Islamic temple. And you go in without shoes and you worship in this. We call it the Dome of the Rock. It has a dome and it has the rocks that Abraham offered up Isaac. Now remember, Abraham and the Islamic people consider Abraham their father too, because Ishmael was also a son of Abraham. So we see these rocks here, and this is the carpet where you walk with no shoes. Again, the Dome of the Rock in Israel. The Emperor Herod, he was a paranoid person, but he was a very famous builder. He was always afraid someone was coming after him. He killed his wife. He killed his sons. He killed anyone that he thought was a threat to him. And he would build palaces as retreats. And one he built is called Masada. It's on top of a mountain top where there were bakeries, there was water, we had water. A person could live up there for years. And the Romans in 70 A.D., the Israelites rebelled against Rome. And they went and they took up in this fortress called Masada. The whole Roman army and you can go and rent the film. It's called Masada. And they had to take this hill because 600 people up against 5,000 Roman soldiers. But they had bakeries up there. They had all kinds of food. They had water. And it was a palace that Herod built and used that palace conveniently. This is how it looked when it was in its heyday. This is how it looks today. I was here, unfortunately, one time and someone slipped and passed away because of a fall. But here, this mountain, right by the Dead Sea in Israel, like they light it up at night, but it is the palace, the fortress built by Herod the Great. And when these zealots saw that they could not hold out against the Roman army, why? Because the Roman army started building a ramp up, and when they saw that, they committed suicide. Some 600 zealots on top of Masada. It's a great place of pride for the Israeli people, and you should go and see it. Another big piece of architecture around the world is the palace at Versailles. Here's where Louis and his wife had some 14,000, I think it was Louis XVI, had 14,000 people working in gardening and maintaining these hundreds of rooms in this palace, the palace at Versailles. And inside is what we call the Hall of Mirrors. And this was where the treaty for World War I was signed in the Palace of Versailles. Going into Jerusalem, it's another interesting piece of architecture. It's called the Museum of the Book. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found around 1947. It's a long story, but in Qumran, a young lad was with his sheep and goat, and he thought his goat might have gone into a cave. He threw a stone in there and it hit a bottle. And he went in to see it and reported it. And it turned out that the Essenes had stored all of these old scriptures in animal skins, on papyrus paper, in these bottles, worth millions and millions of dollars, because it was the history, much of Jewish history, written in Hebrew, not Greek. See, Alexander the Great, when he conquered the world, he changed everything, including the Bible, into Greek. But in this case, they built a museum. They call it the Museum of the Book. And inside, they have some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have it airtight where it would last another 1,000 or 2,000 years. One of the marvels of all architecture is this post and lintel simplicity in Stonehenge, England. How did they get it up there? How did they lift these stones? And in Paris, we have a museum that you should all visit. It's called the Louvre. It would take you 2 weeks to see everything in the Louvre, but the most famous piece of fine art or painting located there is the famous Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa. This is outside with a modern pyramid, but inside the Louvre, you will see artwork from all over the world. Matter of fact, during the World War II, Hitler tried to steal a lot of the artworks, particularly the impressionistic works, out of this museum. And then there were many imitators of Rome in architecture. Monticello was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was quite a versatile individual, and he was architect, he was collector, he was writer, he was politician, and besides being our third president. So this introduces us to architecture, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the museums that you should see, particularly architectural museums around New York.